May 28, 1453, the ancient walls of Constantinople. Emperor Constantine XI. Palaiologos stood on the ramparts as the sun set over the city that bore his ancestor's name, watching the campfires of 80,000 Ottoman soldiers flicker to life across the plain. The 49-year-old emperor had ruled for barely 4 years, inheriting not an empire but a memory wrapped in stone. The Byzantine Empire, once stretching from Spain to Persia, had contracted to a single city and a few islands. Constantinople itself, which had housed 400,000 souls in its golden age, now sheltered fewer than 50,000 within walls that enclosed empty fields where neighbourhoods once thrived. Beside Constantine stood Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese mercenary captain who had arrived 4 months earlier with 700 professional soldiers, his own fortune spent to defend a city that wasn't his. The contrast between these two men embodied the desperate alliance that would attempt to hold back the inevitable. Constantine, last of the Palaiologos dynasty, trained as both scholar and soldier, who had spent his reign begging Western Christendom for help that never came. Giustiniani, a nobleman from a merchant republic, expert in siege warfare, who had sailed east when no kings would. Below them, manning 14 miles of fortifications with barely 7,000 defenders, Greeks stood beside Venetians, Orthodox monks beside Catholic volunteers, all knowing that across those walls waited the largest and best-equipped army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. And at the head of that army sat a 21-year-old sultan, who had dreamed of this moment since childhood. This is the story of when the cross met the crescent, when an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years made its final stand, when medieval Christendom's greatest city fell to a new power that would reshape the world. The siege that ended on May 29, 1453 didn't just capture a city, it closed one age of history and opened another. Mehmed II was born on March 30, 1432 in Edirne, then the Ottoman capital. His father, Sultan Murad II, had initially named him governor of Amasya at age 11, training him in the arts of war and statecraft. But Mehmed's education went far beyond military matters. He studied with the finest Islamic scholars, learned Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Persian, and even some Latin. He read philosophy, theology, and military history. From childhood, he was obsessed with a single idea: the conquest of Constantinople. The city had resisted Ottoman sieges in 1391, 1394, 1402, 1411, and 1422. Its triple walls, built by Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century, had turned back Goths, Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Russians. Even the Fourth Crusade had needed treachery from within to breach them. But young Mehmed saw something others had missed. The age of walls was ending. The age of gunpowder had arrived. When his father briefly abdicated in 1444, placing 12-year-old Mehmed on the throne, the boy sultan faced immediate crisis. A crusader army crossed the Danube, threatening the empire. Mehmed's advisors forced him to recall his father from retirement. Murad returned, destroyed the crusaders at Varna, and reclaimed the throne, relegating Mehmed to provincial governorship. The humiliation burned. When Murad died in February 1451, Mehmed ascended again, now 19 years old. His first act revealed his character. He executed his infant half-brother to eliminate succession disputes, a brutality that would mark his reign. His second act revealed his genius. He began preparing for Constantinople. The city's greatest natural defence was the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Byzantine ships could control access, bringing supplies and reinforcements while keeping Ottoman vessels at bay. Mehmed's solution was audacious. In 1452, he constructed the Rumeli Hisari fortress at the narrowest point of the Bosphorus, directly across from an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. The two fortifications created a killing zone where Ottoman cannons could destroy any ship attempting passage. When a Venetian vessel refused to stop for inspection in November 1452, Ottoman guns sank it. The crew was beheaded, the captain impaled. The message was clear. Constantinople was now isolated. But Mehmed's true innovation involved artillery on a scale never before attempted. In 1452, a Hungarian engineer and gunsmith named Urban approached Emperor Constantine, offering his services in casting great cannons. Constantine, desperate for any advantage, listened eagerly. Then Urban named his price. The emperor's treasury was empty. He could offer only apologies. Urban took his proposal to Mehmed. The Sultan asked one question. "Can you cast a cannon capable of destroying the walls of Constantinople?" Urban's response entered legend. "I can cast a cannon of bronze with the capacity of the stone you want. I have examined the walls of the city in great detail. I can shatter to dust not only these walls with the stones from my gun, but the very walls of Babylon itself." Mehmed gave Urban unlimited resources. The result was a monster. The Great Bombard measured 27 feet long, with a barrel diameter of over 30 inches. The bronze walls were 8 inches thick. It could fire a 2,200-pound stone ball over a mile. The cannon was so massive that 60 oxen and 200 men were required to haul it from Edirne to Constantinople, a journey taking 2 months. Road crews had to reinforce bridges and level hills. Urban cast dozens of other cannons, creating an artillery train of over 70 guns, some medium-sized for accuracy, others monstrous for sheer destructive power. No city had ever faced such concentrated firepower. In Constantinople, Constantine understood what was coming. The emperor had taken the throne in January 1449, crowned not in the great Hagia Sophia Cathedral, but at Mistras in the Peloponnese, because Constantinople itself was too impoverished for a proper coronation. He inherited an empire consisting of the capital city, a few islands, and the Morea Peninsula in southern Greece. Ottoman territory surrounded him completely. Constantine's greatest challenge wasn't just military, it was religious. The Byzantine Church and people fiercely rejected union with the Catholic Church, despite the Council of Florence in 1439 attempting reconciliation. Constantine desperately needed Western military aid, but that aid came with the price of accepting papal authority. When he finally agreed to proclaim church union in Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452, he satisfied Rome while enraging his own people. Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, one of his chief advisors, famously declared he would rather see the Turkish turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre. The religious divide nearly split the city even before the siege began. Help from the west arrived in pathetic quantities. Venice, with its enormous navy and commercial empire, promised support but moved with agonizing slowness. The Venetian Senate voted to send ships in February 1453, but bureaucracy and logistics delayed departure until April. By then it was too late. The ships never arrived. Genoa, Venice's great rival, officially declared neutrality to protect its profitable trade arrangements with the Ottomans. However, individual Genoese, including those from the colony at Galata across the Golden Horn, chose to fight. The most important was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Giustiniani arrived on January 29, 1453, with 2 ships carrying 700 professional soldiers, 400 of them Genoese, others from the Aegean island of Chios. He had financed the expedition himself, spending his personal fortune to recruit, equip, and transport these men. Why did a nobleman from a wealthy merchant family commit his resources and his life to defend a foreign city? The sources don't say, but 3 possibilities exist. Perhaps mercenary honour, the code that demanded skilled warriors defend Christian strongholds against Islamic expansion. Perhaps personal connections, as Genoa maintained a large colony in Constantinople, and Giustiniani likely had friends or family there. Perhaps redemption, as some nobles convicted of crimes sought to restore their honour through military service in desperate causes. Whatever his motivation, his arrival transformed Constantine's defensive capabilities. The emperor immediately appointed Giustiniani commander of the land forces, protostrator in Byzantine terminology. It was a wise choice. Giustiniani was renowned as an expert in siege warfare and defence of fortified positions. More importantly, he could unite the fractious defenders. Greeks resented Latins, Venetians despised Genoese. Orthodox Christians hated Catholics. Only Giustiniani had the authority and charisma to make them cooperate. Constantine ordered a census in March 1453 to determine his available manpower. The results were devastating. His chancellor, George Francis, recorded the final count: 4,573 Greek defenders plus approximately 2,000 foreigners, mostly Italian. Something less than 7,000 men to defend 14 miles of walls, towers and fortifications. 1 defender for every 10 feet of wall, against 80,000 attackers. The walls themselves were Constantinople's greatest asset. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the 5th century after the city expanded beyond Constantine's original fortifications, consisted of multiple defensive layers. An outer wall 20 feet high, backed by a terrace, then an inner wall 40 feet high with 96 towers reaching 60 feet. In front of the outer wall lay a wide moat, 60 feet across and 30 feet deep. Any attacking army would face this obstacle course, while defenders rained arrows, stones, and Greek fire, the Byzantine secret weapon that burned even on water, from the heights. For 1,000 years these walls had been impregnable, but they were designed to resist medieval siege engines, not modern artillery, and the defenders could not man every section adequately. Constantine and Giustiniani had to prioritize. The sea walls along the Golden Horn and the Marmara coast, though long, faced less threat. Ottoman ships would have difficulty attacking them. The defenders stretched thin along these sections, trusting the natural barriers. The critical sector was the western land walls, the only approach not protected by water. This 4-mile stretch became the focus of defence. Giustiniani took personal command of the most vulnerable point, the Mesotichion section, in the centre of the land walls where the Lycus River valley created lower ground, making the walls there slightly less formidable. The emperor gave him the best troops available, Greeks and Italians together. At the Golden Horn sea walls, Constantine stationed the Venetian contingent under Alvise Diedo, who commanded the few ships available, about 26 vessels total, including those belonging to Italian merchants. Prince Orhan, a pretender to the Ottoman throne who had lived in Constantinople for years, commanded Turkish troops, men who had rebelled against their former master and now fought for the Byzantines. Even these enemies of Mehmed numbered only a few hundred. The Genoese colony at Galata, across the Golden Horn, declared neutrality. They would not fight for Constantinople, but they would shelter refugees. This neutrality later proved problematic, as some Galata Genoese actively helped the Ottomans. Religious volunteers supplemented the military forces. Monks from the city's many monasteries manned sections of the wall, prayers alternating with archery. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate, had recruited 200 soldiers in Naples with papal funds and led them personally. These Catholic reinforcements arrived despite the religious tensions, fighting for a church that despised them. On April 2nd, 1453, Mehmed's army appeared before Constantinople. The sight must have been overwhelming. The Ottoman camp stretched as far as defenders could see. Mehmed positioned himself opposite the Mesotichion, the weakest section of wall, pitching his red and gold imperial tent where he could personally direct operations. His elite Janissaries, Christian boys taken as children, converted to Islam, and trained as the finest infantry in the world, formed the assault troops. They numbered about 12,000, fanatically loyal and superbly disciplined. Behind them, regular troops from Anatolia and Europe, numbering perhaps 50,000. Behind those, irregular troops, the Bashibazouks, motivated more by plunder than discipline but useful for exhausting defenders. Mehmed's fleet of 320 vessels, most transports and supply ships, but including war galleys, assembled in the Bosphorus. The Ottomans were experts at siege warfare, having perfected their craft over decades of conquest. But never had they brought such resources to bear on a single target. On April 5th, Mehmed sent an envoy to Constantine with terms: surrender the city and the population would be spared. Refuse, and Islamic law permitted 3 days of unrestricted pillage after conquest. Constantine's response was dignified and defiant. I cannot surrender the city without the consent of the people. We have decided to die of our own free will, and we shall not consider our lives. He knew the end was inevitable. He chose honour over survival. On April 6th at dawn, Urban's great bombard fired its first shot. The enormous stone ball arced through the air and smashed into the outer wall near the Mesotichion. A section of wall collapsed. Cheers erupted from the Ottoman lines. Despair filled the defenders. This was something new. Throughout the day, Ottoman cannons bombarded the walls. The great bombard could fire only 7 times per day because the barrel became dangerously hot, requiring hours to cool, but even 7 shots could devastate. Other cannons fired more frequently, creating a near-constant barrage. The noise was apocalyptic. The earth shook, masonry crumbled, dust clouds obscured the battlefield. Each night defenders worked frantically to repair the breaches, using timber, rubble, earth, anything available to plug the gaps. They constructed inner barricades behind damaged sections, creating fallback positions. Giustiniani supervised these repairs personally, his organisational skills keeping pace with Ottoman destruction. The pattern would continue for 53 days. Ottoman guns would batter the walls by day, defenders would repair them by night. But each cycle left the walls weaker, the defenders more exhausted. The Ottomans also attempted mining operations. Sappers dug tunnels under the walls, planning to collapse them with explosive charges or create entry points. But the Byzantines had a secret weapon of their own. A Scottish engineer named John Grant, who had expertise in countermining, listened for tunnelling sounds, located Ottoman mines, and either collapsed them or broke through to fight the sappers underground. This brutal subterranean warfare continued throughout the siege, Grant's skill preventing multiple breaches. The Golden Horn presented another challenge. This inlet formed Constantinople's northern harbour, protected from Ottoman ships by an enormous chain boom stretched across its mouth from Constantinople to Galata. Heavy links floated on wooden platforms impassable to vessels. As long as the chain held, the northern sea walls remained secure. Mehmed devised an audacious solution. If his ships couldn't sail through the boom, they would sail over the land. Ottoman engineers constructed a greased roadway of logs running from the Bosphorus, over the hills behind Galata, down to the Golden Horn above the chain. On April 22nd, in a single night, Ottoman crews hauled 70 ships overland using oxen, ropes, and thousands of men. Sails were raised. Oars dipped into the water as if the ships had sailed normally. By morning, the Ottoman fleet floated inside the Golden Horn, threatening the previously secure northern walls. The defenders' shock was total. How could ships fly over hills? It seemed like sorcery. Constantine was forced to redeploy troops to man the Golden Horn walls, stretching his already thin forces even thinner. The Venetians attempted to counterattack the Ottoman ships in the Horn with fireships on April 28th, but Genoese from neutral Galata betrayed the plan to the Ottomans. The attack failed, costing several vessels and precious manpower. By early May, the siege had settled into a grinding war of attrition. The Ottomans bombarded, assaulted, and mined. The defenders repaired, counterattacked, and held. But everyone knew time favoured the besiegers. Constantine's desperate pleas for relief went unanswered. Venice's promised fleet remained in port. The Pope's promised ships never materialised. The kingdoms of Western Europe, consumed by their own conflicts, sent nothing. Constantinople was alone. On May 22nd, an omen appeared that terrified both sides. The moon rose eclipsed, showing only a thin crescent instead of the expected full circle. Ancient prophecies claimed Constantinople would never fall until the full moon gave a sign. The defenders saw their doom written in the sky. Mehmed's advisers urged him to withdraw, fearing divine intervention. But the young sultan refused to abandon his dream. He called a council of war on May 25th. Some advisers argued for raising the siege. Winter approached, disease threatened the army. Rumours spoke of a Christian relief force gathering in the west. Others, particularly Grand Vizier Zaganos Pasha, insisted on one final overwhelming assault. Mehmed sided with aggression. He ordered preparations for a massive attack to be launched on May 29th. In Constantinople, Constantine addressed his defenders on May 27th. The emperor's words, recorded by several chroniclers, captured the desperation of the moment. "Gentlemen, illustrious captains of the army and our brethren, you know well that the hour has come, the enemy of our faith wishes, to oppress us even more closely by sea and land with all his engines and skill to attack us with the entire strength of this siege force. You are heroes. Prove your valour. The defenders knew what was coming. They spent May 28th in final preparations, repairs to the walls, distribution of the last reserves of gunpowder and arrows, confession and communion for those who wished it." That evening, Constantine led a procession through the city. Orthodox and Catholic clergy marched together, ancient rivalries forgotten in the face of extinction. The emperor prayed at Hagia Sophia, that magnificent cathedral that had stood for 900 years. Then he rode to the walls to take his position. At midnight on May 29th, the assault began. Mehmed ordered his disposable troops forward first. The Bashi bazooks, irregular forces promised plunder but little discipline, charged the walls in waves. Their purpose was not to breach the defences, but to exhaust the defenders, using up ammunition and energy. For 2 hours they attacked and died. The walls held. Then came the regular troops, professional soldiers from Anatolia and Europe. Better armed, better trained, they pressed harder. Scaling ladders rose against the walls. Hand-to-hand combat erupted on the battlements. Giustiniani was everywhere, his distinctive armour marking him as he rushed from crisis point to crisis point, rallying defenders, organising counterattacks. The regular troops fell back. Then came the Janissaries. Mehmet's elite infantry advanced in perfect order, drums beating a rhythm that had terrified enemies across 2 continents. They focused on the Mesitikyon, where weeks of bombardment had left the walls weakest. Giustiniani met them with the best defenders, Greeks and Italians fighting side by side. The combat was savage. Men stabbed with swords, fired at point-blank range, threw stones, bit and clawed. Bodies piled at the base of the walls. The Janissaries could not break through, but they did not retreat. They kept coming. Just before dawn, catastrophe struck the defence. Giustiniani was wounded. Sources differ on the exact circumstances. Some say a cannonball fragment struck him. Others claim an arrow or crossbow bolt. The wound's location is also disputed. Chest, arm or leg. Whatever the details, the injury was serious enough to force him from the wall. Giustiniani's men carried him toward the harbour, seeking a ship to take him to safety on Chios. As word spread that the defence commander had left his post, morale collapsed. Men who had fought all night suddenly felt their courage drain away. Panic began to spread. Mehmed, observing from his command post, recognised the moment. He ordered the Janissaries to launch one final assault with everything they had. They surged forward. At almost the same moment, Ottoman soldiers discovered a small gate. The Kirka Porta had been left unlocked. This minor entrance in the wall near the Blachernay Palace was normally used by defenders making sorties. In the chaos of battle, someone had forgotten to relock it after the last patrol returned. Approximately 50 Ottoman soldiers slipped through and climbed to the top of the inner wall, raising the Ottoman flag. The defenders saw the flag and believed all was lost. The wall had been breached in multiple places. Giustiniani was gone. Ottoman banners flew from the battlements. The line broke. Janissaries poured through the gaps. Emperor Constantine, realizing the end had come, made his final decision. He would not flee. He would not surrender. He would die as a Roman emperor should, sword in hand, fighting for his city. According to most accounts, Constantine tore off his imperial regalia to avoid identification, drew his sword, and charged into the Ottoman troops pouring through the breach. He was never seen again. His body was never definitively identified. In later centuries, Greek legend transformed him into the Marble Emperor, sleeping beneath the city, waiting to return and reclaim Constantinople when the time was right. But on May 29th, 1453, Constantine XI Palaiologos died fighting, and with him died the Byzantine Empire, the last continuation of the Roman Empire that had begun with Augustus 1,480 years earlier. The Ottomans poured into the city. According to Islamic law, because Constantinople had refused to surrender, it could be subjected to 3 days of pillage. Ottoman soldiers spread through the streets seeking plunder, slaves and blood. The scenes were horrific. Thousands of civilians were killed. An estimated 50,000 were taken as slaves. Churches were looted. Houses were burned. The great chain across the Golden Horn was broken. Ottoman ships sailed into the harbour unopposed. Some defenders managed to escape on Italian ships that slipped out during the chaos. The Venetian merchant vessels, the Genoese traders, anyone with a boat who could navigate past the Ottoman fleet. Several thousand made it to safety, carrying news of the fall to a shocked Europe. Giovanni Giustiniani died on June 1st on the island of Chios, succumbing to his wounds. His body was buried there in the village of Pyrgi. Debate continues whether he abandoned his post in cowardice or was incapacitated by serious injury. Venetian sources hostile to Genoa claimed cowardice. Genoese sources insisted on his heroism. The truth likely lies between. He was seriously wounded and evacuated, a military decision that unfortunately coincided with the final crisis. But by afternoon on May 29th, the killing and looting had mostly stopped. Mehmed rode into the city and went directly to Hagia Sophia. He dismounted, picked up a handful of earth, and sprinkled it on his turban as a gesture of humility before God. Then he entered the great cathedral. A Turkish soldier was breaking up marble flooring for plunder. Mehmed struck him with his sword and declared the looting over. Hagia Sophia would become a mosque, but it would be preserved. He ordered his troops back to camp. The 3-day sack would last only 1 day. What Mehmed did next reveals the complexity of his character. He ordered that the Christian population could remain in Constantinople and practice their faith. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadius Scholarios, and granted him authority over the Christian community. The patriarch in turn recognized Mehmed as the legitimate successor to the Byzantine emperors, the new Caesar of Rome. This arrangement, the millet system, would govern Ottoman relations with religious minorities for centuries. Christians and Jews would govern themselves according to their own laws under the overall authority of the Sultan. Mehmed began transforming Constantinople into Istanbul, though the formal name change took decades. He made it his capital, replacing Adrianople. The Ottoman Empire, previously a frontier state in Anatolia, now controlled the gateway between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. From this strategic position, Ottoman power would dominate southeastern Europe for over 400 years. Mehmed commissioned massive building projects. The Topkapi Palace became his residence and the administrative heart of the empire. New mosques rose across the city. He invited Greek scholars, Italian humanists, and Jewish refugees expelled from Spain to settle in his new capital. He collected a library of thousands of books in Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. He patronized artists including the Venetian painter Gentil Bellini, who created a famous portrait of him. The Sultan, who conquered through force of arms, also sought to conquer through culture and learning. But why did Constantinople fall after surviving so many sieges? Several factors converged. First, the walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years could not withstand modern artillery. Urban's cannons represented new military technology that rendered medieval fortifications obsolete. This was the beginning of the gunpowder age when castles and city walls lost their invincibility. Second, Constantinople lacked defenders. 7,000 men could not adequately defend 14 miles of walls against 80,000 attackers. The population decline from 400,000 to 50,000 over 3 centuries meant insufficient manpower. Third, Western Christendom abandoned Constantinople. Despite desperate pleas, no meaningful relief force arrived. Religious divisions between Orthodox and Catholic, commercial rivalries between Italian city-states, and the preoccupation of Western kingdoms with their own conflicts meant Constantinople fought essentially alone. Fourth, Ottoman military organization and resources overwhelmed the defenders. Mehmed commanded not just quantity but quality. His Janissaries were superbly trained, his engineers were innovative, his logistics were efficient. He had the wealth of an empire to fund the siege. Fifth, leadership and determination mattered. Mehmed's obsession with conquering Constantinople drove him to attempt what others had failed. Constantine's courage kept the defence going far longer than seemed possible. Giustiniani's expertise maximised the defenders' limited capabilities, but in the end, courage and skill could not overcome the imbalance of forces. Some historians mark May 29, 1453 as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. The fall of Constantinople forced Western Europe to seek new trade routes to the east, contributing to the age of exploration. Christopher Columbus sailed west seeking a route to Asia that didn't pass through Ottoman-controlled territory. The Byzantine Greek scholars who fled west brought classical texts that accelerated the Italian Renaissance. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe reshaped the continent's political geography. The psychological impact was immense. Constantinople, the new Rome, had stood as Christendom's eastern bastion for over 1,000 years. Its fall shocked Europe profoundly. Some saw it as divine punishment, others as a call to crusade. Many realized the world had fundamentally changed. For the Orthodox Christian world, the catastrophe was even more profound. Constantinople had been not just a political capital, but the center of their religious universe. The ecumenical patriarch resided there. The greatest churches and holiest relics were housed there. When it fell, Orthodox Christians felt orphaned. The legacy lived on in places like Russia, where Moscow began styling itself as the Third Rome, heir to Constantinople's spiritual authority. In Greece, occupied by the Ottomans for nearly 400 years, the memory of Constantinople and Constantine XI became powerful symbols of resistance. The legend of the Marble Emperor sleeping until the city could be liberated expressed the hope that Byzantine glory would return. Even today, the fall of Constantinople resonates in Greek national consciousness. For the Islamic world, Mehmed's conquest represented a tremendous victory. Muslim forces had besieged Constantinople multiple times since the 7th century. Its capture fulfilled prophecies that the city would eventually fall to a Muslim army. Mehmed took the title Caesar-i Rum, Caesar of Rome, claiming to be the legitimate heir to the Roman Empire. The transformation of Hagia Sophia from Christianity's greatest cathedral into Islam's grandest mosque symbolized the shift in power. For modern Turkey, Mehmed the Conqueror remains a national hero. Statues, bridges, and institutions bear his name. May 29th is celebrated as the conquest of Istanbul. The event that ended the Byzantine Empire began the Ottoman Empire's golden age. Yet the siege also demonstrated the costs of war. Thousands died on both sides. A magnificent city was looted and partially destroyed. Centuries of accumulated art, literature, and architecture were lost. The great library of Constantinople, with irreplaceable ancient manuscripts, was burned or scattered. We can only imagine what knowledge perished in those flames. The technological innovations of the siege had lasting impact. Urban's Great Bombard and its siblings demonstrated that artillery could breach any fortification. Within decades, European castles and city walls were being redesigned or abandoned. The age of the fortified stone castle ended. New fortifications featured low, thick walls that could absorb cannonballs, angled bastions that provided crossfire and depth rather than height. Warfare had changed permanently. The naval innovation of hauling ships overland entered military history as a bold, creative solution. Though rarely repeated because of the enormous effort required, it showed that determined commanders could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Mehmed's willingness to attempt the unprecedented gave him advantages his enemies didn't anticipate. The siege also illustrated the importance of leadership. Constantine's courage inspired his outnumbered defenders to resist for 53 days against overwhelming odds. Without his personal example, the defense might have collapsed in days. Giustiniani's organizational skills and tactical expertise maximized the potential of limited forces. His wounding at the critical moment proved decisive, showing how individual actions can determine the course of history. Mehmed's determination and strategic vision drove the entire enterprise. Lesser commanders might have abandoned the siege when difficulties mounted, but the 21-year-old Sultan refused to accept failure. The story of when the cross met the Crescent at Constantinople is ultimately about the collision of two worlds. The old world of Byzantine Christianity, heir to classical Rome and Greece, sophisticated, cultured, but exhausted and declining. The new world of Ottoman power, young, vigorous, expanding, bringing its own sophisticated culture rooted in Persian and Islamic traditions. For centuries these worlds had coexisted, sometimes fighting, sometimes trading, always influencing each other. The siege and its aftermath were not simply about Muslim conquest of Christian territory. They represented the transfer of power from one civilization to another, from the medieval world to the early modern world, from the age of castles to the age of gunpowder. In the years following 1453, Mehmed continued his conquests. He took the remainder of Byzantine territory in Greece. He conquered Serbia and Bosnia, expanding deep into the Balkans. He attacked Italian territories, briefly capturing Otranto in southern Italy in 1480, before his death in 1481 ended that campaign. His dream of recreating the Roman Empire remained unfulfilled, but he had transformed the Ottoman state into a great power that would endure for over 450 years. The Byzantine refugees who escaped Constantinople scattered across Europe. Some went to Italy, where their knowledge of Greek language and literature contributed to the Renaissance. The famous scholar Bessarion brought his extensive collection of Greek manuscripts to Venice, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Others went to Crete, Cyprus, and other Venetian-held islands. Some eventually made their way to Russia. Wherever they went, they carried memories of the fallen city and the civilization it represented. The architectural legacy of Byzantine Constantinople survived within Ottoman Istanbul. The Ottomans preserved many Byzantine structures, converting some churches to mosques, but maintaining the basic structures. Hagia Sophia remained intact, its Christian mosaics plastered over but not destroyed. In the 20th century, After Turkey became a secular republic, many of these mosaics were uncovered and restored. Today, Hagia Sophia serves as a museum and mosque, a physical embodiment of the city's layered history. Walking through Istanbul today, you can still trace the Theodosian walls, though now they cut through modern neighbourhoods rather than open fields. Sections have been restored, giving visitors a sense of their medieval grandeur. The ruins of Rumel-Hisari, Mehmed's fortress, still stand on the Bosphorus shore. The Topkapi Palace, built after the conquest, houses museums displaying Ottoman imperial treasures. The story of the siege has inspired countless works of art and literature over the centuries. Painters depicted the drama of the final assault. Poets mourned the fall of the city. Historians analysed the causes and consequences. The siege became a symbol, interpreted differently depending on perspective. For some, it represents the triumph of determination and superior military force. For others, it illustrates the tragedy of a great civilization's end. For still others, it demonstrates the importance of technological innovation in warfare. All these interpretations contain truth. On the walls of Constantinople in those final hours before dawn on May 29, 1453, exhausted defenders faced the Janissary's final assault knowing defeat was imminent. Emperor Constantine drew his sword and advanced toward the breach, choosing death over surrender. In that moment, he embodied the Roman virtues that had sustained an empire for over 400 years: courage, duty, honour. Those virtues died with him on the blood-soaked walls, but they entered history as an example of leadership in the face of certain defeat. Across the battlefield, young Sultan Mehmed directed his troops with strategic brilliance, his obsessive dream finally becoming reality. In that moment, he embodied the ambition and capability that would drive the Ottoman Empire to greatness. He proved that youth and determination could overcome age and experience, that new methods could defeat old fortifications, that disciplined preparation could achieve seemingly impossible goals. Between them stood men like Giustiniani, fighting for a city not their own because honour and faith demanded it. Venetians and Genoese, ancient commercial rivals, defending walls side by side. Orthodox monks and Catholic volunteers, praying to the same God in different ways. Greeks and Turks who had defected to fight for their adopted homeland. In their desperate, futile defence, they showed that courage exists independent of outcome, that fighting for a cause matters even when victory is impossible. The cannons fired their final shots as the sun rose on May 29th. Ottoman soldiers poured through the breaches. The Byzantine Empire, which had preserved Roman civilization, Greek culture, and Christian faith for over a millennium, ended not with a whimper, but with a battle that entered legend. Constantine XI. Palaiologos disappeared into history, his body never found, his death witnessed only by those who died with him. But his memory survived. The last emperor who chose to die with his city rather than flee became a symbol of defiant courage. Giovanni Giustiniani died of his wounds days later, his reputation debated then as now, hero or coward, loyal defender or deserter. The truth is he was human, wounded, facing an impossible situation, making decisions in the chaos of battle. His choice to finance and lead 700 men to defend a foreign city against overwhelming odds speaks to his character more than the disputed circumstances of his final hour. Mehmed the Conqueror entered Hagia Sophia as Sultan and emerged as Emperor, his youthful dream realised, his place in history secured. He would rule for 28 more years, expanding the empire, patronising arts and sciences, administering justice, and earning his epithet, the Conqueror. His complex personality, combining ruthless violence with cultural sophistication, brutal ambition with religious tolerance, defined the Ottoman state for generations. The thunder of artillery, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of dying men, the prayers of the desperate, all faded into silence as the fighting ended. Constantinople became Istanbul. The crescent replaced the cross atop Hagia Sophia. An empire ended and another began. The medieval age gave way to the early modern era. And the memory of when the cross met the crescent at the walls of Constantinople entered history as one of the pivotal moments when the world changed forever. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul proceeded with remarkable speed. Within weeks of the conquest, Mehmed issued a decree that shocked many of his advisors. He ordered the restoration of civil order and the protection of the remaining Christian population. Ottoman soldiers who continued looting after the decreed 3 days were punished. The Sultan understood that a city was valuable not as ruins but as a functioning capital. He needed inhabitants, craftsmen, merchants and administrators to make his new capital prosper. Mehmed's decree of 1453 offered incentives to both Muslims and Christians to settle in Istanbul. Former residents who had fled could return and reclaim their property. Christians from Anatolia were offered tax breaks to relocate. He even forcibly resettled Turkish families from various provinces, a policy that would characterize Ottoman demographic engineering for centuries. The population, which had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 before the siege, began growing immediately. Within a decade, Istanbul housed over 100,000 residents, Muslims, Christians and Jews, living in separate quarters but under the same imperial administration. The fate of the city's treasures varied dramatically. Some of the most precious relics of Christendom disappeared during the 3 days of pillage. The crown of thorns, supposedly worn by Jesus at his crucifixion, had actually been sold by Byzantine emperors to French King Louis IX 2 centuries earlier and resided in Paris. But countless other relics, icons encrusted with jewels, golden chalices, illuminated manuscripts and sacred objects accumulated over 1,000 years were looted, melted down for their precious metals, or scattered across the Ottoman Empire. The Library of Constantinople, which housed texts from the classical world that existed nowhere else, was partially destroyed. Some manuscripts were burned for fuel, others were used as packing material, many simply disappeared. Ottoman officials did preserve some texts, particularly scientific and mathematical works that interested Islamic scholars. Greek scholars fleeing the city carried what they could, and these rescued manuscripts would help fuel the Italian Renaissance. But the losses were catastrophic. We will never know exactly what knowledge perished in the chaos of conquest. The church of Hagia Sophia underwent immediate transformation. Mehmed ordered it converted to a mosque within hours of entering the city. Christian mosaics depicting Jesus, Mary and the saints were plastered over to comply with Islamic prohibition against figurative religious art. 4 minarets were eventually added to the exterior, transforming the Byzantine silhouette into an Islamic one. A mihrab indicating the direction of Mecca was installed. The altar was removed, yet the basic structure remained intact. Mehmed recognized the architectural magnificence of the building. The massive dome, 180 feet high and over 100 feet in diameter, had been an engineering marvel when completed in 537 AD under Emperor Justinian. It remained the largest cathedral dome in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Ottoman architects studied its construction and incorporated Byzantine techniques into their own building projects. The great architect Mimar Sinan, who would design the Süleymaniye Mosque and other masterpieces in the following century, learned from Byzantine predecessors even as he created distinctly Ottoman aesthetics. The military lessons of the siege spread rapidly across Europe and the Islamic world. Every military commander studied what had happened at Constantinople. The effectiveness of artillery dominated these analyses. Within a generation, cannon became standard equipment for any army besieging fortified positions. This arms race accelerated dramatically. Guns became larger, more powerful, more accurate. Fortification design evolved in response. The vertical walls that had protected medieval cities became obsolete. Military engineers developed the Trace Italian style of fortification, featuring low, thick walls that could absorb cannon fire, angled bastions that allowed defenders to provide crossfire against attackers, and complex systems of ditches, ravelins and outworks that kept besiegers' artillery at a distance. The star-shaped forts that appeared across Europe in the 16th century were direct descendants of lessons learned at Constantinople. European monarchs also drew political lessons. The Ottoman Empire's centralized administration, professional standing army, and efficient tax collection impressed observers who saw how effectively Mehmed could mobilize resources. European kingdoms in this period still relied heavily on feudal levies and mercenaries. The Janissaries demonstrated the value of professional soldiers trained from youth and maintained year-round. France, Spain and other powers would develop their own standing armies in the following decades, transforming European warfare from feudal to professional. The conquest's economic impact reverberated across 3 continents. Constantinople had been a major trading hub connecting Europe, Asia and the Middle East for over 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire's collapse and Ottoman control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits disrupted established trade routes. Venetian and Genoese merchants who had dominated trade in the region faced new Ottoman tariffs and restrictions. Some Italian city-states maintained profitable relationships with the Ottomans, negotiating favourable trading agreements. Venice, after briefly considering war, signed a peace treaty with Mehmed in 1454, accepting Ottoman dominance in exchange for continued trading privileges. But the overall effect was to make eastern trade more difficult and expensive for Europeans. This economic pressure contributed to European exploration of alternative routes to Asia. Portuguese navigators pushed south along the African coast, eventually rounding the Cape of Good Hope to reach India directly by sea. Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, seeking a route to Asia that would bypass Ottoman-controlled territories entirely. Though he found the Americas instead of Asia, his motivation was directly connected to the post-1453 geopolitical situation. The fall of Constantinople thus inadvertently contributed to the age of exploration and European colonialism. The psychological and cultural impact on Christian Europe was profound and long-lasting. Constantinople had been seen as an eternal city, the divinely protected capital of Orthodox Christianity, the bulwark against Islamic expansion. Its fall shattered assumptions about Christian civilization's permanence and superiority. Pope Nicholas V called for a new crusade to recapture the city, but European monarchs showed little enthusiasm. The age of crusades was effectively over. Religious rhetoric remained important, but practical political and economic considerations dominated decision-making. Some Christian intellectuals interpreted the fall as divine punishment for Byzantine sins, particularly the schism between Orthodox and Catholic churches. Others saw it as a sign of the apocalypse, believing the end times were approaching. The mood was one of crisis and uncertainty. The Renaissance humanists, who celebrated classical Greek and Roman culture, mourned the loss of Constantinople as the heir to ancient civilization. Yet paradoxically, the influx of Greek scholars and manuscripts fleeing the conquered city enriched Italian intellectual life. The study of classical Greek language and literature, which had declined in Western Europe during the medieval period, experienced a renaissance of its own. Works by Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and other ancient authors became available in original Greek, sparking new translations and commentaries. This classical revival influenced European philosophy, literature, and science for centuries. In the Orthodox Christian world, the catastrophe reshaped religious and political identity. The ecumenical patriarch, traditionally based in Constantinople, continued to function under Ottoman rule, but his authority was compromised by submission to Islamic sultans. Orthodox communities in the Balkans, Greece, and Anatolia found themselves subjects of Muslim rulers. The Ottoman millet system allowed religious communities substantial autonomy in personal and religious matters, but Orthodox Christians were clearly second-class citizens. They paid special taxes, faced restrictions on building churches, and could not testify against Muslims in court. Yet the system also protected them from forced conversion and allowed Orthodox Christianity to survive. The Russian Orthodox Church increasingly saw itself as the true heir to Byzantine Christianity. Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow married Sophia Palaiologina, niece of Constantine XI, in 1472, symbolically claiming succession to Byzantine imperial authority. Russian religious thinkers developed the doctrine of Moscow as the Third Rome, succeeding Old Rome and Constantinople as the centre of true Christianity. This ideology would influence Russian imperial ambitions for centuries, contributing to Russian expansion southward toward Constantinople and the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire's character was fundamentally shaped by the conquest. Mehmed's transformation of his realm from a frontier principality into a world empire required administrative innovations. He reorganized the government, creating a more centralized bureaucracy. The Devshirm system, which recruited Christian boys for conversion to Islam and training as Janissaries or administrators, was expanded. This created a class of slaves directly loyal to the Sultan, without independent power bases. Mehmed also codified law, combining Islamic Sharia with customary Ottoman regulations and Byzantine administrative practices. This legal synthesis allowed the empire to govern diverse populations across 3 continents. The Sultan positioned himself as both Islamic caliph and Roman emperor, claiming universal authority in both traditions. Mehmed's personal interests shaped Ottoman culture at the highest levels. He collected books in multiple languages, maintained correspondence with Italian humanists, and commissioned works of art and architecture that blended Islamic, Byzantine, and Renaissance influences. His court attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from across the known world. This cosmopolitan character would mark Istanbul for centuries. Ottoman tolerance for religious diversity, though limited by modern standards, was remarkable for the 15th century. Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 found refuge in Ottoman lands, including Istanbul. The city became one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse urban centres in the world. The military innovations continued under Mehmed's successors. His son Bayezid II and grandson Selim I expanded the empire further. Selim conquered Syria, Egypt, and the Hejaz, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, between 1516 and 1517. This transformed the Ottoman Sultan into the protector of Islam's holiest sites, greatly enhancing the empire's prestige in the Muslim world. Suleiman the Magnificent, Mehmed's great-grandson, brought the empire to its zenith in the 16th century. Ottoman armies besieged Vienna in 1529, bringing Islamic forces to the heart of Central Europe for the first time. Though the siege failed, it demonstrated Ottoman power. At its peak under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire controlled southeastern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. This vast realm traced directly to Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople, which provided the strategic position and imperial prestige necessary for such expansion. The artillery innovations pioneered at Constantinople continued developing. By the early 16th century, cannon were being mounted on ships, creating naval warfare's transformation. The age of ramming and boarding gave way to the age of broadside cannon fire. Ottoman and European fleets engaged in major naval battles in the Mediterranean, with artillery determining outcomes. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Christian coalition defeated the Ottoman fleet, showcased how completely gunpowder weapons had transformed naval combat. Even infantry tactics evolved. The Janissaries were early adopters of firearms, using arquebuses and later muskets to devastating effect. European armies followed suit. By the end of the 16th century, pike and shot formations combining pikemen with musketeers dominated battlefields. The heavily armoured knight, dominant in medieval warfare, became obsolete. Gunpowder weapons could penetrate armour at ranges where lances and swords were useless. The military revolution that began with Urban's Great Bombard at Constantinople cascaded through all aspects of warfare. The memory of the siege lived on in both Ottoman and Christian traditions, interpreted very differently. Ottoman chroniclers celebrated Mehmed's achievement as the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy. According to a hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, Constantinople would eventually be conquered by a Muslim army, and the commander who achieved this would be greatly favoured. Mehmed styled himself as that blessed conqueror. Ottoman historians portrayed the siege as a heroic triumph of faith and determination over impossible odds. The fact that Constantinople's walls had resisted so many previous sieges made Mehmed's success even more glorious. Folk songs and poems celebrated the conquest, embedding it deeply in Turkish cultural memory. Christian sources presented a darker narrative. Greek chronicles mourned the catastrophe, describing atrocities during the sack and lamenting the end of the Roman Empire. Western European sources, while acknowledging Ottoman military prowess, emphasized Christian martyrdom and sacrifice. The story of Constantine XI's death became legendary, with various accounts providing different details but agreeing on his heroic end. Emperor choosing death over surrender became a model of Christian kingship and martial virtue. The debate over what could have saved Constantinople has continued for over 5 centuries. Historians have identified several critical factors. If the Western Crusade proposed by Pope Nicholas V had materialized before the siege, a relief force might have compelled Mehmed to withdraw or divided his attention. But Western Europe's political fragmentation and the religious schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches prevented effective cooperation. The Venetian Senate's delay in sending its fleet proved fatal. Had Venetian galleys arrived in April rather than remaining in port, they might have prevented the Ottoman fleet from crossing into the Golden Horn, keeping the northern wall secure and allowing Constantine to concentrate defenders on the land walls. The Kirkaporta Gate, left unlocked at the critical moment, may have been the single most consequential mistake. If that gate had remained secured, the Ottoman penetration that broke defender morale might not have occurred. The siege might have continued, exhausting both sides, potentially forcing negotiations. Giustiniani's wounding at dawn on May 29th removed the defence's most capable commander at the worst possible time. If he had remained in position for even another hour, the final assault might have been repulsed, buying time for relief or Ottoman exhaustion. But these what-ifs assume Constantinople could have survived long-term. The fundamental reality was that a city of 50,000 people could not indefinitely resist an empire of millions. Even if Mehmed had failed in 1453, he or his successors would have tried again. The Byzantine Empire was dying. The question was not whether it would fall, but when and how. The archaeological legacy of the siege remains visible in Istanbul today. Sections of the Theodosian walls show cannon damage from 1453, though subsequent earthquakes and repairs make it difficult to distinguish original damage from later deterioration. The walls themselves are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognised as one of the most important fortifications in history. Excavations have uncovered cannonballs from the siege, including stone balls weighing over half a ton that could only have been fired by guns like Urban's Great Bombard. These physical artefacts connect modern visitors to the violence of 1453. The Janissary fortress, built by Mehmed in 1452 to blockade the Bosphorus, has been restored and serves as a museum and concert venue. Its massive walls and towers demonstrate Ottoman engineering capabilities on the eve of the conquest. Standing in the fortress and looking across to the Asian shore, one can appreciate the strategic genius of Mehmed's plan to control the strait. Hagia Sophia itself underwent significant changes in the 20th century. After the Ottoman Empire fell and Turkey became a republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the building was secularized and converted to a museum in 1935. Restoration work uncovered Byzantine mosaics that had been hidden under plaster for nearly 500 years. These magnificent artworks depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various emperors and saints reminded visitors of the building's Christian origins. In 2020, the Turkish government reconverted Hagia Sophia to a mosque while maintaining public access for tourists. This decision sparked international controversy, with Orthodox Christians particularly distressed. The building remains a powerful symbol of the conquest and its continuing legacy. The personalities of the siege's major figures have been debated and reinterpreted by each generation. Mehmed the Conqueror's reputation has fluctuated wildly. Ottoman sources portrayed him as a brilliant military commander, enlightened patron of arts and learning, and just ruler who expanded the empire to greatness. His darker actions, including fratricide, execution of officials who displeased him, and the brutality of his military campaigns, were minimized or justified as necessary for effective rule. Western Christian sources, particularly contemporary ones, depicted him as a cruel tyrant, destroyer of Christian civilization, an existential threat to Europe. The reality was more complex. Mehmed was genuinely learned, fluent in multiple languages, interested in philosophy and science, and capable of appreciating beauty in art and architecture. He was also ruthlessly pragmatic, willing to employ any means to achieve his goals. His contradictions reflect the contradictions of his age, a time when cultural sophistication and extreme violence coexisted comfortably in most rulers, modern Turkish. Nationalism has elevated Mehmed to legendary status as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Conqueror. He represents the founding of Ottoman greatness and Turkish pride. Statues, museums, bridges, and universities bear his name. May 29th is commemorated annually as the conquest of Istanbul, yet even in Turkey, historians debate aspects of his reign and character. Constantine XI has undergone similar reinterpretation. Contemporary sources, both Greek and Latin, emphasized his piety, courage, and tragic fate. He became a martyr figure, the last emperor who chose honor over survival. Greek nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, as Greece struggled against and eventually won independence from Ottoman rule, lionized Constantine as the symbol of Byzantine greatness and resistance to Turkish domination. The legend of the Marble Emperor, sleeping beneath the city until Greeks reclaimed Constantinople, expressed irredentist dreams that persisted well into the 20th century. Modern historians have tried to assess Constantine more objectively. He inherited an impossible situation, ruling an empire that existed in name only. His achievements were limited by lack of resources. His failures were largely unavoidable given the circumstances, Yet his courage in the final battle was genuine. He could have fled, as other Byzantine emperors had done in previous crises. He chose to stay and fight. That choice resonated across centuries. Giovanni Giustiniani remains the most controversial figure. His early death prevented him from defending his reputation. Venetian sources, hostile to Genoa, accused him of cowardice, claiming he abandoned his post when the situation became dangerous. Genoese sources insisted he was gravely wounded and evacuated against his will, dying of his injuries days later. Modern historians examining the sources tend toward the Genoese interpretation. The wound was real and serious. His evacuation, while unfortunate in timing, was medically necessary. His earlier leadership had been exemplary. The defence lasted as long as it did largely due to his organisational skills and tactical expertise. His decision to spend his personal fortune raising and equipping 700 soldiers to defend a foreign city speaks to his character. Yet the debate continues. Some historians argue that a true hero would have remained at his post even mortally wounded, that his removal at the critical moment, regardless of justification, contributed directly to the collapse of defence. Others respond that expecting men to die unnecessarily when their deaths would serve no purpose is absurd. Giustiniani's legacy remains debated because the question of duty versus survival in impossible situations admits no easy answer. The technological impact of the siege extended far beyond artillery. The successful use of massive cannon to breach fortifications thought impregnable inspired innovations in metallurgy, engineering and ballistics. Casting large bronze guns required sophisticated techniques in metal working. The barrels had to be uniform in thickness, free of air bubbles or impurities that could cause catastrophic failure. The powder charges had to be calculated precisely to maximize range and impact without exploding the gun. The projectiles had to fit the bore exactly. All these technical challenges drove improvements in manufacturing and quality control that spread to other industries. The logistics of moving Urban's Great Bombard from Moderne to Constantinople demonstrated capabilities in civil engineering. Building roads capable of bearing such weight, constructing bridges strong enough to support 60 oxen plus the gun carriage, and coordinating the labour of thousands of workers required planning and execution that impressed contemporary observers. Ottoman administrative efficiency became legendary in this period, and the successful siege logistics were a major reason why. Naval innovations also emerged, the Ottomans' hauling of ships overland into the Golden Horn, while not unprecedented in military history, was executed at a scale and speed that shocked observers. Roman and Viking sources mention portaging ships around obstacles, but moving 70 vessels in a single night represented organisational achievement as much as engineering feat. The greased log roadway had to support enormous weights while allowing smooth passage. The operation required precise coordination of thousands of workers through the night. That it succeeded demonstrated Ottoman capabilities in planning and executing complex operations. The cultural exchange between Ottoman and European civilizations accelerated after 1453. Despite being military enemies, the Ottomans and Europeans maintained extensive trade relationships and diplomatic contacts. Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, had permanent ambassadors in Istanbul. These ambassadors reported on Ottoman politics, military capabilities, and cultural developments. Their reports shaped European understanding of the Islamic world. Similarly, Ottoman ambassadors visited European courts, bringing back information about Western technology, politics, and culture. This mutual observation, despite hostility, facilitated technology transfer and cultural influence flowing in both directions. Ottoman architecture incorporated Byzantine elements while developing distinctly Islamic aesthetics. European artists travelled to Ottoman lands, and their works showed Islamic influences. Diplomatic gifts exchanged between rulers included art, books, and luxury goods that exposed each culture to the other's achievements. The Ottoman court's cosmopolitanism, with Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and other minorities serving in high positions, created an environment where different traditions mixed. European captives and converts to Islam brought Western knowledge into Ottoman service. Renegades, Christians who converted and joined Ottoman military or administrative ranks, transferred skills and information across civilizations. This cultural porosity, even during periods of intense military conflict, enriched both societies. The long-term economic consequences of Ottoman control of Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean trade routes reshaped global economics. European dependence on Asian luxury goods, particularly spices, silk and porcelain, had enriched Italian merchants who controlled Mediterranean trade. Ottoman dominance threatened to cut Europe off from these goods, or at least make them much more expensive. This economic pressure drove European powers to seek alternative routes. Portuguese exploration of the African coast, begun before 1453, intensified afterward. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 opened a direct sea route that bypassed Ottoman territories entirely. This shifted economic power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, benefiting Portugal, Spain, England and the Netherlands while disadvantaging Italian city-states. The age of exploration, with all its world-changing consequences, was partly driven by European response to Ottoman control of traditional trade routes. The discovery and colonization of the Americas, the establishment of European colonial empires in Asia and Africa, and the eventual rise of Western European global dominance all trace connections back to the geopolitical situation created by Constantinople's fall. While many factors contributed to these developments, the Ottoman barrier to Eastern trade was significant. Had Constantinople remained Byzantine, or had it fallen to a power friendlier to European trade, the history of exploration and colonialism might have developed very differently. The military balance between Ottoman and European powers shifted over the following centuries. In the immediate aftermath of 1453, Ottoman expansion seemed unstoppable. Mehmed's successors conquered the Balkans, Hungary, much of the Middle East and North Africa. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 brought Ottoman forces to the gates of Central Europe. But European powers gradually developed effective responses. The Holy League's victory at Lepanto in 1571, though not strategically decisive, demonstrated that Ottoman forces could be defeated. European military innovations, particularly in artillery and infantry tactics, eventually matched and exceeded Ottoman capabilities. By the late 17th century, the balance had shifted. The Ottoman Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 ended in catastrophic defeat, beginning a long decline. European powers, particularly Austria and Russia, began conquering Ottoman territories. Yet the empire survived until World War I, adapting and reforming to meet changing circumstances. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century modernized Ottoman administration and military along European lines. But internal problems, nationalist movements among subject peoples, and European imperialism gradually dismembered the empire, when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in 1922, ending 470 years after Mehmed rode through Constantinople's gates. The modern Republic of Turkey emerged from its core territories. The wheel had turned. The empire born from Constantinople's conquest died from European military and economic dominance. The human stories from the siege continued resonating through families and communities. Thousands of Greeks taken as slaves in 1453 and their descendants preserved memories of the catastrophe across generations. Some converted to Islam and integrated into Ottoman society. Others maintained their Orthodox Christian faith and identity despite second-class status. The Greek communities in Istanbul, greatly reduced from their Byzantine-era predominance, nevertheless survived as minorities through Ottoman rule and into modern Turkey. Their churches, schools, and cultural institutions kept alive memory of Byzantium and the dream of restoration. These communities faced periodic persecution, particularly in the early 20th century when Greek-Turkish nationalist conflicts led to population exchanges and violence. By the late 20th century, only a few thousand Greeks remained in Istanbul, down from hundreds of thousands before World War I. Today, the Greek community in Istanbul numbers only a few thousand people, elderly and diminishing. But they maintain their traditions and their churches, living reminders of continuity stretching back to before the conquest. The descendants of the Italian defenders also carried forward their ancestors' legacy. Families in Genoa and Venice preserved records of relatives who fought and died at Constantinople. Giustiniani's family commemorated his role for generations. The wound he suffered and his death on Chios became part of family history, passed down to children and grandchildren. Similar stories existed in dozens of Italian families. The veterans who escaped the siege and returned home carried memories of the catastrophe. They had witnessed the end of an empire, fought in one of history's epic sieges, and survived to tell the tale. Their accounts, recorded in letters, chronicles, and family traditions, provided much of what we know about the defenders' perspective. These first-hand testimonies, preserved in archives across Italy, remain primary sources for historians studying the siege. The Ottoman soldiers and commanders also carried memories forward. Veterans of the conquest received honours and rewards. Some were granted land, others received positions in imperial administration. The prestige of having participated in the Great Conquest followed them for life. Their descendants bragged of ancestors who fought with Mehmed the Conqueror. Ottoman military units that particularly distinguished themselves in the assault received honorary titles and privileges. These institutional memories persisted for centuries within Ottoman military culture. The Janissaries, whose final assault broke through the walls, took special pride in their role. They saw themselves as the elite force that had achieved what countless previous armies had failed to accomplish. The intellectual legacy of the siege influenced European thought in profound ways. The Renaissance humanists who mourned Byzantium's fall also celebrated the Greek learning that Byzantine refugees brought west. The study of ancient philosophy, particularly Plato, flourished as manuscripts previously unavailable in Western Europe reached Italy. The Platonic Academy in Florence, founded by Cosimo de' Medici and led by Marsilio Ficino, represented the culmination of this revival. Byzantine scholars like Cardinal Bessarion contributed directly to Western intellectual life, teaching Greek, translating ancient texts, and participating in philosophical debates. This cross-fertilization between Byzantine and Western Christian thought enriched both traditions. The Protestant Reformation of the early 16th century was influenced by the fall of Constantinople in subtle ways. The catastrophe prompted some Christians to question whether institutional churches had failed, whether corruption and worldliness had invited divine punishment. Martin Luther's critiques of Catholic Church corruption echoed earlier Byzantine criticisms. The fact that Western Christendom had failed to save Constantinople from Muslim conquest suggested to some that Christian unity under papal authority was hollow. These connections were not direct or simple, but the crisis of confidence created by Byzantium's fall contributed to the religious upheavals that followed. The cartographic and geographic knowledge transferred during and after the conquest also mattered. Byzantine scholars had preserved ancient Greek geographic texts, including Ptolemy's Geography, which described the known world with remarkable accuracy for its time. When these texts reached Western Europe through Byzantine refugees, they influenced European understanding of world geography. Columbus consulted Ptolemy when planning his westward voyage. The ancient geographic knowledge, preserved in Constantinople's libraries and brought west after 1453, thus indirectly contributed to the age of exploration. Ottoman geographic knowledge also benefited from Byzantine sources. Ottoman cartographers in the 16th century, particularly Piri Reis, created remarkably accurate maps incorporating information from Greek, Arab, and increasingly European sources. Piri Reis's 1513 world map, which survives in fragmentary form, shows details of the Americas just decades after Columbus, suggesting remarkably rapid information transfer. The intellectual environment of post-conquest Istanbul, where scholars from multiple traditions interacted, facilitated this kind of knowledge synthesis. The memory of Constantinople's fall continues shaping modern politics and identity. For Greeks, the catastrophe remains a defining trauma. Greek irredentism, the dream of reclaiming Istanbul and restoring Byzantine glory, influenced Greek foreign policy well into the 20th century. The Megali idea, the great idea of recreating a Greek empire centered on Constantinople, drove Greek expansion into Ottoman territories in the 19th century. This culminated in the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, when Greek forces invaded Anatolia seeking to realize irredentist dreams. The catastrophic defeat and population exchanges that followed ended any realistic prospect of Greeks reclaiming Istanbul, but the emotional connection remains. For Turks, the conquest represents national pride and the founding moment of Ottoman greatness. Debates in modern Turkey about secularism versus Islamism often reference the conquest and Mehmed's legacy. Islamist politicians invoke the glory of Ottoman Islamic Empire. Secularists emphasize Mehmed's cosmopolitanism and tolerance. These competing interpretations of the same historical event reflect contemporary political conflicts. The reconversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque in 2020 must be understood in this context. It was not merely about religious practice, but about asserting a particular interpretation of Turkish identity rooted in Ottoman Islamic heritage. The Siege of Constantinople, 570 years after it occurred, remains relevant because it touches on themes that continue mattering. The clash between civilizations, though we must be careful not to oversimplify or essentialize cultural differences. The role of technology in warfare and how innovation can overcome traditional advantages. The importance of leadership, both inspiring leaders like Constantine and Mehmed who shape events, and capable subordinates like Justiniani who execute plans. The limits of courage and determination when facing overwhelming material disadvantage. The tragedy of great civilizations ending not with dramatic suddenness, but through long decline punctuated by final catastrophe. The complex relationships between enemies who fight yet also influence each other. These themes transcend the specific historical moment, which is why the story continues resonating. When the cross met the Crescent at the walls of Constantinople in May 1453, two worlds collided with consequences that reverberated across centuries. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome and bastion of Orthodox Christianity, made its final stand and went down fighting. The Ottoman Empire claimed the great city and embarked on centuries of expansion and glory. And the modern world, shaped by that collision, emerged from the rubble of the Theodosian walls and the transformation of Hagia Sophia. The thunder of Urban's great bombard announced not just the fall of a city, but the end of an age and the beginning of another. 5.5 centuries later, we still hear echoes of that thunder and feel ripples from that earthquake in history.